Welcome back for another deep dive. You know, we love to take a big stack of research and pull out the most fascinating insights. And today we're tackling a topic that feels like it's just everywhere these days. Identity politics.
It really is.
But have you ever stopped to think, like, where did this intense focus on identity come from? Why does it feel like everything has become this us versus them kind of dynamic?
Right.
To get to the bottom of this, we are diving deep into Mary Eberstadt's book,
Oh, good one.
Primal Screams: How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics.
Yeah,
But we're also going to be pulling in some really sharp commentary from Rod Dreher,
of course.
Mark Lilla, and Peter Thiel.
It's a good group.
We've got a lot to cover.
Yeah.
Now, what I thought was so interesting about Eberstadt's approach is how she starts with this almost jarring image, wolves,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, you think of the lone wolf archetype, and she kind of flips that on its head.
She does. It turns out that lone wolf archetype is completely off base.
So you're telling me wolves are actually big softies who love family time?
Well, Eberstadt points out that wolves, just like humans, are deeply family-oriented.
Interesting.
They live in these close-knit packs that function very much like nuclear or extended families.
Wow.
And this isn't just some random animal fact.
Right.
It actually points to something much more fundamental about our own human nature.
So even though we might not be howling at the moon together like a wolf pack,
Right.
the need for that deep connection is still wired into us.
Exactly. Think about it. Like, family is where we first learn who we are, how to behave in the world, where we get that initial sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And Eberstadt argues that this need for connection is so primal, it's almost like a biological imperative.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, Eberstadt also talks about this idea of the great scattering.
Yes.
How does that fit into all of this?
So this is where things get really interesting. Eberstadt uses this term, great scattering, to describe this unprecedented fragmentation of families that's happened in Western societies really since the 1960s. We're talking about rising divorce rates, more kids born outside of marriage, smaller families overall, people moving away from their hometowns. It's like we've become increasingly disconnected from those traditional family ties.
Yeah, I mean, families are definitely changing. But how does that connect to something as big and as complex as identity politics?
This is where Eberstadt's argument gets really provocative.
Okay.
She links this great scattering directly to the rise of identity politics. Her idea is that as those traditional family bonds weaken, we start searching for that sense of belonging and identity in other places.
It makes sense.
And often we find it in groups based on race, gender, sexual orientation,
Right.
characteristics that we share with others, but that also set us apart.
So it's almost like we're taking that primal need for family and trying to fit it into these new identity-based groups.
Precisely. And you can see how this manifests.
Yeah.
You see it in those very heated debates about cultural appropriation, the surge in white nationalist movements.
Even the incel phenomenon.
There's this intense focus on what belongs to my group,
Right.
a very strong sense of ownership over identity,
Yeah.
and often a feeling of being wronged when someone outside the group tries to claim it.
It's almost like that primal scream of a toddler
Yes.
who doesn't want to share their toys.
Totally.
Except instead of toys, it's about culture heritage, even a sense of belonging in the world.
That's a really insightful connection.
Yeah.
And that's what makes identity politics so powerful and potentially dangerous.
Yeah.
It taps into these very, very deep-seated emotions.
Right.
This sense of fear, anger, resentment, because it's tied to our very sense of self.
Yeah.
People react fiercely when their identity feels challenged or threatened.
It can even lead to like a mob mentality, can it?
It can?
A willingness to shut down opposing viewpoints entirely.
Absolutely.
Now,
Eberstadt takes this framework and she applies it to feminism as well.
okay, I'm curious to hear how she connects the dots there.
This is where things get a bit more nuanced. Eberstadt argues that despite its claims of empowerment, a lot of contemporary feminism can actually be seen as a reaction to the vulnerabilities that were created by the very sexual revolution it often embraces.
Hold on, so feminism is a consequence of the thing that it's trying to move beyond.
It is a little bit ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
But think about it. The rise of pornography, the persistence of sexual harassment,
Right.
the fact that violence against women is still a huge problem. All of these things have understandably created this sense of fear and defensiveness among a lot of women.
So they're turning to feminism as a way to fight back against those very real dangers.
Exactly. It's almost like a survival strategy in a world where those traditional protections of family and those clearly defined roles have eroded. And you see this reflected in a lot of feminist rhetoric and tactics, which can be quite aggressive and confrontational.
Right. And I can definitely see how that us versus them dynamic plays out there. But if we're hardwired for connection and family is breaking down, doesn't it make sense that people are trying to find that sense of belonging somewhere, even if it's in these potentially divisive identity groups?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's like we're all trying to piece together a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing.
Yeah.
We're not even sure what the final picture is supposed to look like.
Right.
And Eberstadt's book, I think, is really just the beginning of that exploration.
Okay. So we've talked about family,
Yes.
identity politics, and feminism. Where do we go from here?
Well, one of the things that Eberstadt points out is that we're seeing this trend towards a much more androgynous society.
Okay.
Like, the traditional lines between male and female are becoming increasingly blurred.
Androgyny. What does that have to do with anything?
Well, Eberstadt suggests it could be another response to the breakdown of that traditional family structure.
Okay.
If those traditional roles no longer offer a clear sense of belonging or purpose, maybe we try to create new identities that transcend those old categories altogether.
So we're questioning the very definition of what it means to be male or female.
Exactly. And you see it playing out in so many different ways.
Like how?
Well, think about unisex fashion, the debates over transgender bathrooms,
Okay.
the growing number of girls who are participating in traditionally male-dominated sports.
It's like we're trying to figure out what it means to be human in a world where those old categories are no longer feeling quite so fixed.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, speaking of blurring boundaries, let's talk about the hashtag #MeToo movement.
Yes.
Eberstadt calls it a symptom of social illiteracy. And I'm really intrigued by that phrase. What does she mean by that?
Well, she's arguing that beneath the surface of the hashtag #MeToo movement, with all of its complexities and controversies, there's this deeper problem, a breakdown in the way that men and women are learning to relate to each other.
Because those traditional structures that provided clear guidelines for how to behave, especially in romantic and sexual situations, they're just not there anymore.
Exactly. Think about it this way. Eberstadt points to research showing that monkeys learn to fear snakes by watching other monkeys react.
Wow.
It's not instinctual. It's learned behavior through observation. And she argues that the Great Scattering has disrupted those natural social learning processes for humans.
Oh, so it's not just about bad individuals. It's about a whole generation that's missing some of those basic social cues.
That's one way to look at it. And then when you combine that with the rise of pornography, which often presents this very distorted view of sex and relationships, it creates this environment that's ripe for misunderstanding and miscommunication.
Which is evident in so many of the hashtag #MeToo stories.
It is.
It's like people are speaking different languages when it comes to consent, respect, even basic human interaction.
That's a really insightful observation. And I think Eberstadt would agree. She's arguing that we're seeing the consequences of this social illiteracy play out in real time, often with very devastating results.
Now, we've been focusing a lot on Mary Eberstadt's perspective so far.
Yes.
But she's not the only voice in this conversation.
No.
You know, we also have some really interesting insights from other contributors to her book, like Rod Dreher, Mark Lilla, and Peter Thiel, each bringing something really unique to the table.
They do. Mark Lilla, for example. He argues that there are larger historical forces at play here, like wealth and embourgeoisement, that are also driving identity politics.
So it's not just about family breakdown. There's more to the story.
That's Lilla's point.
Yeah.
He suggests that as societies become wealthier, people have more leisure time and resources to focus on things like personal identity. They're less worried about basic survival.
Right.
And more interested in figuring out who they are and where they fit in. And that can lead to this more individualized and identity-focused approach to politics.
That makes sense. What about Peter Thiel? What's his take on all of this?
Thiel zeroes in on the economic anxieties of our time.
Okay.
He argues that events like the 2008 financial crisis and the growing uncertainty about the future are also fueling this identity crisis.
So when people feel economically insecure, they start clinging even more tightly to their identity groups.
I think that's part of it. It's like when things feel unstable, we look for someone to blame.
Right.
Someone who's different from us.
An other.
Yes, an other that we can define ourselves against. And they can easily feed into that us versus them mentality that's so common in identity politics.
Yeah, it's like we're dealing with this perfect storm of social, cultural, and economic factors all colliding at once. What about Rod Dreher?
Yeah.
He's the one who came up with the Benedict option.
That's right. Dreher is concerned with the decline of traditional religious faith and its connection to the rise of identity politics.
So as religion loses its influence, does identity politics kind of rush in to fill the void?
I think that's one interpretation. Religion traditionally offered a really strong sense of meaning, purpose, and belonging, something larger than oneself to be a part of. But as more people are moving away from those traditional faiths, those needs don't just disappear.
Of course not. So they're looking for that same fulfillment, that same sense of community,
Right.
but they're finding it in identity groups.
That's definitely part of the appeal for some people. And Dreher's Benedict option is this really fascinating response to this. He suggests that traditional Christians should essentially withdraw from mainstream society and create these intentional communities where they can preserve their values and beliefs.
So it's like creating a safe space for faith in a world that's becoming increasingly secular?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
Though Dreher emphasizes that it's not about hiding from the world or rejecting those who are different. It's more about building a resilient alternative, a way to live out one's faith authentically in a culture that's often hostile to those values.
So he's acknowledging that the landscape has shifted.
Yeah.
And he's proposing a way to navigate it without compromising those deeply held beliefs.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting approach.
It is. And it speaks to the fact that we're dealing with some really seismic shifts in our society, shifts that are impacting everything from our personal relationships to the way we engage in politics.
Yeah.
And these changes are raising some really profound questions about who we are, where we belong, and what it means to be human in the 21st century.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is.
And we are just getting started.
Yes.
Stay with us. As we're talking about all this, something that really struck me in Eberstadt's book is this idea of phantom family members.
Oh, yeah.
It sounds kind of spooky.
Yeah.
But it's actually really poignant when you think about it.
It is. It's all the people who are missing from our lives because of that great scattering we talked about earlier.
Right.
Think about it. Like the siblings you might have had if your parents hadn't divorced or chose to have a smaller family. Aunts, uncles, cousins who live far away. Even potential step-siblings who might have come and gone as your parents navigated new relationships.
Yeah.
It creates this sense of loss,
Right.
even if we don't consciously realize it's there.
It's almost like there's this whole parallel universe of relationships
Right.
that could have existed but didn't because of these larger social shifts.
Exactly.
And I can see how that could contribute to a feeling of emptiness or a longing for connection.
It makes sense. I mean, we're constantly bombarded with images of these happy families on social media.
Right.
But our own lived experiences often fall short of that ideal.
Totally.
And that gap, that sense that something's missing, can make us much more susceptible to the allure of these identity groups.
And we're just trying to fill that void with something.
Yeah.
Anything that offers a sense of belonging and purpose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But as we've been talking about, identity politics can be a bit of a double-edged sword.
Right.
It can offer that sense of community.
Yeah.
But it also has that potential to be really divisive.
Absolutely. It's like we're hardwired for connection,
Right.
but the very forces that are pulling us apart are also driving us to seek that connection
Yes.
in ways that can be both positive and negative.
It is a paradox.
Yeah.
And instead of focusing on the things that unite us as human beings, identity politics often highlights our differences and creates this us versus them mentality.
And that makes it so much harder to have productive conversations.
Oh, yeah.
To find common ground, to even agree on basic facts sometimes.
Absolutely.
It's like everyone's retreating into their own ideological trenches and just shouting at each other across the divide.
That's a great analogy.
Now, we touched on this earlier, but I think it's worth exploring a bit more this trend towards androgyny.
Yes.
How does that fit into the larger picture of identity politics and the breakdown of the family?
Well, as we discussed, Eberstadt suggests that this rise of androgyny could be seen as a reaction to the uncertainty that's created by the breakdown of these traditional gender roles.
Right.
If those old categories no longer offer a clear sense of identity or belonging, maybe we try to create new ones that transcend those limitations.
So we're questioning the very idea of this binary system of male and female.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
And it is a fascinating cultural development.
Yeah.
But it also raises a lot of questions. if gender is fluid and subjective, what does that mean for our relationships,
Right.
our families, our society as a whole? How do we navigate this new landscape where the old rules no longer apply?
And it feels like a lot of people are really struggling with that right now.
They are.
It's such a sensitive and controversial topic.
Yeah.
And it often gets so caught up in these intense political debates.
It does. And that's why I think it's so important to approach this conversation with empathy
Yes.
and a willingness to listen to different perspectives.
Right.
We need to be able to talk about these issues openly and honestly
Of course.
without shutting down dialogue or resorting to name-calling.
Okay. So we've talked about family, identity politics, androgyny, the hashtag #MeToo movement. But we can't ignore the elephant in the room.
Which is,
Religion.
oh yes, of
Yep.
course. Where does that fit into all of this?
Where does it fit into this whole puzzle?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
As Rod Dreher argues, the decline of traditional religious faith is another major piece of this puzzle.
Right.
You know, for centuries, religion provided people with this incredibly strong sense of community, a shared moral framework, a sense of purpose and belonging that really transcended individual identity.
Right.
But as those institutions have weakened,
Yeah.
people are looking for other sources of meaning and connection.
And for some, they're finding that in identity groups.
That's one possibility. Identity politics can offer that same feeling of solidarity
Right.
and purpose
Yeah.
that people once found in religion. It can become a kind of secular faith,
Wow.
complete with its own set of beliefs, rituals, even sacred texts.
You know, it strikes me that Eberstadt isn't just pointing out all the problems. She's actually offering some solutions as well.
She is. There's a sense of hopefulness that's woven throughout the book.
Yeah. I mean, what are some of those solutions?
Well, one of her main points is that we need to rediscover the importance of family and community.
Okay.
She argues that these are the fundamental building blocks of a healthy society and that we've neglected them at our peril.
So how do we do that? How do we rebuild those structures?
It's not going to be easy,
Right.
but it starts with recognizing their value.
Okay.
It's about making a conscious effort to prioritize family and community in our own lives, to invest time and energy in building those relationships,
Right.
to understand that those connections aren't just nice to have.
Yeah.
They're absolutely essential to our well-being
Right.
as individuals and as a society.
So it's about shifting our priorities,
Yeah.
spending more time with loved ones, getting involved in our communities, really putting in the work to cultivate those connections.
Exactly. It's about rediscovering the simple but profound joys of human connection.
Yeah.
And maybe realizing that our identities aren't just about the groups we belong to,
Right.
but also about the relationships we cultivate with the people around us.
Well, I love that. It's about expanding our definition of identity.
Yes.
Moving beyond those really narrow categories and recognizing the interconnectedness of all things.
Exactly.
And that reminds me of something else that Eberstadt talks about, the loneliness epidemic.
Oh, yes, that's a really important point.
Yeah.
She argues that the decline of family and community has led to this really profound sense of isolation and loneliness,
Right.
especially among the elderly.
Right.
And this isn't just a personal problem.
Yeah.
It's a societal problem with very real consequences.
It's literally making us sick, right?
It is. Loneliness has been linked to a whole host of negative health outcomes, both physical and mental.
Like what?
Well, it weakens our immune systems, increases our risk of heart disease and stroke,
Wow.
contributes to depression and anxiety.
Yeah. It's like we've created a society where people are dying of loneliness.
It really is heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking, and it's a problem that spans generations.
It does.
You know, young people are increasingly reporting feelings of loneliness and isolation as well.
They are. We're losing that sense of connection, that feeling of being part of something larger than ourselves.
That sense of belonging that families used to provide,
Right.
that faith communities used to provide.
Exactly.
Now, Eberstadt even connects this loneliness epidemic to the growing movement for euthanasia.
She does. She suggests that some people are choosing to end their lives because they're simply too lonely and isolated to go on.
Oh, wow.
You know, they've lost all hope, all sense of purpose.
It's a tragic indictment of our society.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it highlights the urgency of finding solutions.
Absolutely.
We can't just sit back and watch as people suffer in silence.
Right.
Eberstadt's book is a powerful call to action.
So where do we go from here? If the sexual revolution has created this ripple effect of unintended consequences,
Right.
how do we start to heal those wounds and build a better future?
Well, I think Eberstadt's book gives us some clues.
Okay, like what?
It's about recognizing the importance of family and community. It's about reconnecting with our spiritual roots. It's about fostering a culture of empathy and understanding.
It's about understanding the interconnectedness of things,
Yes.
seeing the bigger picture,
Right.
and recognizing that our actions have consequences both intended and unintended.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that we're all in this together.
Yes.
We all have a role to play
Yeah.
in creating a more just and compassionate world.
You know, when we were talking earlier about the hashtag #MeToo movement and Eberstadt's concept of social illiteracy, something really clicked for me.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
I started thinking about how this breakdown in social learning isn't just about sex and relationships.
Okay.
It's about all aspects of our lives.
That's a really interesting point. What do you mean?
Well, it's like we've lost those traditional spaces where we used to learn how to interact with each other, how to navigate conflict, how to build healthy relationships.
Right.
Families used to play a big role in that, but so did churches, community organizations, even just hanging out with neighbors on the front porch.
Those informal spaces for social interaction have been declining for decades.
They have. And now, with the rise of social media, we're spending more and more time interacting online,
Right.
which doesn't always translate well to real-world skills.
That's true.
It's like we're learning how to be human beings through a screen,
Right.
and it's creating this disconnect
Yeah.
between the virtual world and the real world.
And that disconnect can have some pretty serious consequences.
Absolutely.
We see it in the rise of cyberbullying, the spread of misinformation, the increasing polarization of our political discourse.
It's like we've forgotten how to talk to each other, how to disagree without being disagreeable, how to see the world from another person's perspective.
You know, Eberstadt talks about how monkeys learn to fear snakes through observation.
Right.
But I'm starting to think that we're also learning how to be afraid of each other through observation.
It's a provocative thought.
It is. And it makes me think about the role of the media in all of this.
Oh, so.
I mean, we're constantly bombarded with these images and stories
Right.
that reinforce those fears, that emphasize our differences, that portray the world as this dangerous and divided place.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we focus on our fears, the more divided we become.
It can be. But the good news is it doesn't have to be this way.
It doesn't.
No.
Yeah.
We can choose to focus on what unites us instead of what divides us.
Okay.
We can choose to listen to each other, to understand each other's stories,
Yeah.
to build bridges instead of walls.
It sounds so simple,
I
but it's
understand.
so hard to do in practice.
It is. But I think Eberstadt is right. If we want to create a more just and compassionate world, we need to start by rediscovering those basic human connections.
It all comes back to that, doesn't it?
It does.
So we need to start talking to each other again,
Yes.
face to face, heart to heart.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all part of the same human family, even if we don't always agree on everything.
We're all in this together.
We are.
Yeah. It does take courage to speak up when everyone else seems to be on board with a particular narrative.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that Eberstadt is calling for is a kind of intellectual rebellion,
Yeah.
a willingness to question those narratives,
Yeah.
especially when they feel limiting or divisive.
Especially when they feel limiting or divisive.
You know, one of the criticisms that Eberstadt has faced is that she's too focused on the negative.
Yeah, I've heard that.
You know, some critics have accused her of being a doom and gloom prophet.
Right? Yeah, I mean, it's true. She doesn't shy away from pointing out the problems,
Right.
but I don't think that's a completely fair characterization of her work.
I agree.
I think she's just being realistic about the challenges that we face.
Right.
You know, she's not sugarcoating anything,
Right.
but she's also not without hope.
Yeah.
She believes that we have the power to change course,
Mm-hmm.
but it's going to require a really concerted effort from all of us.
It's that sense of agency, though.
Yes,
That's so important.
it is.
Feeling like we're not just helpless victims
Right?
of these larger forces,
Yes,
but that we can actually do something to change things.
exactly. And I think one of the most encouraging aspects of Eberstadt's book is her belief in the resilience of the human spirit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she acknowledges that we're facing some very difficult times,
Right.
but she also believes that we have the capacity to overcome these challenges. You know, she points to these historical examples of societies that have faced similar crises
Mm-hmm.
and emerged even stronger on the other side.
So it's not about giving in to despair,
No.
but about tapping into that inner strength, that collective wisdom
Yes.
that has helped humanity navigate difficult times throughout history.
That's right. And I think that's a message that we all need to hear right now.
Mm-hmm.
We need to remember that we're not alone in this.
Right.
That we've faced challenges before.
Right.
And we can face them again together.
Together. You know, listening to all of this, it's hard not to feel a little overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's a lot.
These are big, complex issues.
They are.
With no easy solutions.
Right.
Where do we even begin to address these challenges?
Yeah, it's true. The problems can seem incredibly daunting,
Yeah.
but I think Eberstadt offers us a roadmap, a starting point.
Okay.
She argues that we need to start by rediscovering the importance of family and community.
Okay.
You know, we need to rebuild those bonds of connection
Mm-hmm.
that have been frayed by the forces of individualism and fragmentation.
So it's about starting small, focusing on the things that we can control.
Yeah.
Our own families, our own communities.
Exactly. It's about creating those spaces where people feel seen, heard, and valued,
Right.
where they can develop those really essential social skills,
Yeah.
those habits of empathy and understanding that are so crucial for navigating the complexities of the modern world.
It's about remembering that we're not just isolated individuals, but part of a larger web of relationships.
Exactly.
And that those relationships are not just nice to have,
Right.
they're essential for our well-being,
They are.
both individually and collectively.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the most powerful takeaways from Primal Screams.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reminder that we're not alone, that we have each other,
Mm-hmm.
and that together we can build a better future.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface
We really have.
of this topic, but it's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
Yeah.
And I think that's the mark of a really great book.
Right.
One that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
Mm-hmm.
One that prompts you to ask these new questions
Yeah.
and see the world in a new light.
Absolutely. So if you're feeling inspired to explore these ideas further, I highly recommend checking out Primal Screams and the other sources that we've discussed.
It's a good read.
It's a journey of discovery that is well worth your time.
And remember, this isn't just about understanding the problems.
All right.
It's about finding solutions.
Yeah.
We all have a role to play in building a better future.
Maybe by strengthening our own families and communities, being more mindful of the language that we use, and reaching out to those who are different from us,
Yes.
we can start to weave this new tapestry of human connection.
That's a beautiful vision.
Yeah.
A powerful reminder that even in the midst of all the chaos and division, there's still hope.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
We'll be back soon with more fascinating explorations.